it into the next generation and grew it. I think from there was 60 students when he got there and over 100 when he left. Again, growing our institutions was one of the things he's done. After retirement, he continued teaching at Meadville Lombard, another generation of young people, and a course called Religious Humanism. How about that? In his social justice work, he founded the UU Affordable Housing Corporation, the Montgomery Housing Partnership, and the UU Legislative Ministry of Maryland. In terms of denominational work, he was the settlement representative for ministers for the Joseph Priestley district for about a decade, and he served on several different boards over time. But it is his books for which he is best known. Faith for All Seasons, Liberal Religion and the Crises of Life, from back in 1990. Reason and Reverence, which a lot of people have read. It sold about 5,000 copies over time, which in our humanist world ain't bad, right? Reason and Reverence, Religious Humanism for the 21st Century, translated into Czech, by the way, interestingly enough. And Becoming More Fully Human, Religious Humanism as a Way of Life, which we do have available back on the table, his most recent book. Unfortunately, he can't be here tonight, and so John Hooper is going to accept this award and tell you a little bit more about Bill. So, we don't have a photo. Here we go. All right. Got to do the photo thing.
Definitely.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
All right. Good, good. You're welcome.
Good to see so many of you here. One of the more pleasant discoveries of maturity is that you're never too old or too experienced to not to need a mentor. During the last decade and a half, since I first encountered him at the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, the IRIS conference on Star Island, Bill Murry has been my primary mentor for humanist kinds of things. So it's a real honor and a very humbling experience for me to accept this award on Bill's behalf. Bill can't be here today because he's due to a respiratory illness that he's recently contracted. But I had a pleasant phone conversation with him last Monday, which happened to be his 85th birthday. He said he wishes he could be here to see all his humanist friends, his many former parishioners, and his ministerial and academic colleagues. He really is sad that he can't be here. And so he told me to convey his deep gratitude for being named the first recipient of the UUHA Lifetime Achievement Award. But I believe that it is we, Unitarian Universalists of the humanist persuasion, who owe a debt of gratitude to Bill, because his sermons, books, articles, talks, and his warm, persuasive personal interactions with many of us have been foundational resources in our continuing quest to humanize humanism. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. And this is an excerpt from a UU World article by Bill that is based on his book, Reason and Reverence, which you just mentioned. And I quote, "Religious humanism is a life stance that exults in being alive in this unimaginably vast and breathtakingly beautiful universe, and that finds joy and satisfaction in contributing to human betterment without creed, but with an emphasis on reason, compassion, community, nature, and social responsibility. It is a way of living that answers the religious and spiritual needs of people today." He continues, and I continue to quote, "I espouse a non-theistic faith, a perspective that I call humanistic religious naturalism. Like traditional religious humanism, it rejects the supernatural and maintains that there is only one reality, the natural universe. Traditional humanism, however, has historically been too anthropocentric, whereas for humanistic religious naturalism, it is nature rather than humankind that is ultimate. This lays the foundation for a strong environmental ethic, a necessity in a world threatened by environmental destruction. Bill continues this passage with, and I still continue to quote, "This emergent form of humanism also provides a meaningful story, the epic of evolution. The differences with traditional humanism may seem subtle, but they provide a foundation for a more open, less rationalistic, and more inclusive humanism that speaks to the heart and the soul, not just the intellect." End quote. The Unitarian Universalist Humanist Association strives to internalize this fusion of religious naturalism and religious humanism. Bill's impact continues to be felt in Unitarian Universalist humanist circles. His book, Becoming More Fully Human, Religious Humanism as a Way of Life, was published by the UU Humanist Association. And as I mentioned, Humanist Voices in Unitarian Universalism, published by Skinner House, and edited by Bill Murry and Kendall Gibbons, are both available here at GA. In fact, I think we have them in the back of the room. Is Kendall here? Let me see Kendall. Incidentally, Bill and Kendall are donating their editors' commissions for Humanist Voices to the Unitarian Universalist Humanist Association. I want to use this opportunity to thank them from all of us for that. Let me leave you with a final observation from a man who definitely practices what he preaches. And I quote Bill again. "Becoming more fully human involves the transformation of the mind and heart from self-centeredness to a sense of oneself as part of a larger sacred whole and a deep commitment to the human and natural worlds. It is about the transformation from a shallow life of fear, greed, hedonism, and materialism to a meaningful life of love and caring, gratitude and generosity, fairness and equity, joy and hope, and a profound respect for others." On Bill's behalf, thanks to you all for this award.
Feel free to come on in. We know we're a remote location, and so come on in and join us and, as we go along. Yep.
Would you point out the empty chairs? There are empty chairs.
Up there you go. Good, good. Oh yes, and we're getting a delivery of chairs even as we speak. So thank you, sir. Thanks for coming in with that. The winner of this year's Humanist of the Year award is Dr. Anthony Pinn. How to even begin summarizing his work, which is broad and deep and pioneering. He's edited such books as What is Humanism and Why Does It Matter? Liberation Theologies in the United States. Black Religion and Aesthetics, Religious Thought and Life in Africa and the African Diaspora. He has authored such books as Writing God's Obituary, How a Good Methodist Became a Better Atheist. That's a brilliant book, and if you haven't read it, don't pass go. Just go get it and read it as soon as you can. It is a brilliant, brilliant book. Why Lord? Suffering and the Evil in Black Theology. And his new book that's on the reading list for the UU Humanist Association board members, When Colorblindness Isn't the Answer, Humanism and the Challenge of Race. That is one brilliant book. John's read it twice. I read it once, and I couldn't put it down. It's just, you've got to read it. If your church has a book group, make sure they get a hold of it as soon as possible, because it really, really will affect you. Dr. Pinn is the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities and Professor of Religious Studies at Rice University. He's also the founder and executive director of the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning in Houston, director of research for the Institute for Humanist Studies, and he earned his PhD in the study of religion from Harvard back in 1994. Mr. Pinn, Dr. Pinn, is such a giving human being too. He flew to my church just to talk one weekend and was going to come again if other things hadn't come up. So not only are you a brilliant scholar, but you're also one great guy. And so our Humanist of the Year award this year goes to Dr. Anthony.
Good evening.
Oh.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm delighted to be with you and so honored and grateful for this. This is tremendous. Thank you so very much. I just write what's on my mind, and if people read it, they read it. If they don't, they don't. But I kind of feel like Richard Wright, the novelist Richard Wright, when it comes to this sort of work. If you don't express it, you die. And so I have to write it. I was told we have roughly a half an hour to work with, and so there are a few things I'd like to say, but I'd like to save most of our time for conversation, for us to have an opportunity to chat. And just so you know, I actually did write something. I take this seriously, and I'm honored to be here. So I actually wrote something, but I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to read to you. I'd rather just share a few ideas, and we'll take it from there. There's always been something deeply personal for me in this move towards humanism. It was a way of grounding myself and naming myself when older theological and ideological and political structures no longer fed me. I needed something, a different way of grounding myself and taking seriously what it meant to move through this world, this tragically beautiful world, and humanism was that. So something deeply personal, and but I could not believe that William Jones, who was so very kind to me, that he and I were the only ones doing this, right? That black folks just didn't do this. I could not believe that. And so much of my work revolved around trying to understand how humanism has developed on the so-called margins, right? How it develops within the context of locations that we typically overlook, that we typically understand as not fertile ground for this sort of rich and complex thinking. I needed to explore this in a way that unpacked how humanism develops within the margins. And it wasn't long before I recognized that, at least within the context of African American communities, humanism was older than the country. You're probably familiar with the spirituals, yes? And we cannot accurately date the spirituals. Anybody who tells you we can date the spirituals is lying to you. We cannot date the spirituals. Musicologist John Lovell argues that as enslaved Africans step off the boat and wrestle with this bizarre world, the spirituals are born. But just as old as the spirituals are the secular tunes, the cornfield ditties, the irreverent tunes that come to be called the blues. We cannot accurately date them either, but we know whether or not my ancestors would have named themselves humanist or not, there is something about the sensibilities that are embedded in the blues that speak a certain type of truth that humanists recognize. It's a depiction of the world and a placement in the world that raises questions concerning supernatural claims and is much more content with embodied movement through the world and whatever that results in. And it pushes forward. Of course, there are figures like Henry McNeill Turner, right? This great AME, and Jarena Lee, this wonderful person who is one of the first to lecture publicly on political issues in Boston, right? She's the first black woman to lecture publicly on these, and she is, of course, a Christian, and I get this, but there are ways in which we have overlooked the voices of those for whom theistic sensibilities were not the way to go. And so my work has involved trying to pull these figures out, but then to put them in conversations with a larger tradition as one way of clarifying what it has meant to be black and humanist, but to also give a different type of depth, a different type of tone and texture to what it means to exist in the context of the United States as a humanist, right? To put these various communities into conversation in ways that expose discomfort, expose poor thinking, but also understands that this tradition has already and always been diverse and layered. So on one level, this has been intellectual for me. How do you understand the historical development of humanism as a complex reality? How do you understand this in a way that takes seriously diversity of communities, right? Diversity of thought. This has been important, but it's also been a matter of moral and ethical sensibilities. And much of this, for me, stems from the haunting question asked by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903. Perhaps you're familiar with the text, Souls of Black Folk. And typically when we think of souls of black folk, we think in terms of the Negro problem that he outlines, that problem that he attempts to explore through political maneuvering, through economic rethinking of the nation, through social manipulations, right? That we tend to think in terms of the Negro problem. But before Du Bois chronicles this Negro problem, he raises another, somewhat metaphysical concern. It starts at the very beginning of that text, and he phrases it this way: how does it feel to be a problem? And he says that, that this is the question that never gets asked, that he argues whites, when they approach him, don't ask this question. They say, well, can you believe what's happening? Or I know a nice Negro who lives in the town next to mine. Like this sort of thing. But they never ask this question. And he says they don't ask this question, and he doesn't have an answer. And so for my money, for my mind, this is the question that has to be explored. How does it feel to be a problem? And it's multi-directional, right? On one level, you can think about this in terms of issues of race, gender, and class, but you can also think about this as being a humanist within the context of a country that holds this sort of belief with suspicion. How does it feel to be a problem? I poured through that text, hoping that Du Bois would offer a resolution, that Du Bois would provide an answer. Okay, how does it feel to be a problem? How do you correct for this? But he offers no answer. If you read The Souls of Black Folk carefully, you recognize that for Du Bois, every effort fails. Every attempt at resolution fails. And all we have for Du Bois at the end of the day is our effort. And for me, this was just wonderful. It was actually liberating. Right? The ability to think about moral compass and ethical obligation, what ought we do, in a way that embraces, is comfortable with risk and failure. It just struck me that a humanist sensibility ought to entail a deep regard for and comfort with the potential, really the likelihood of failure. If your humanism is like mine and it's non-theistic, there is no source of appeal, right? To use another of my favorite thinkers' language, Camus. I think the world of that North African. He is tremendous. And this man, in this wonderful book, The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Essays, raises a question, right? How does one live without appeal? right? How do you live in a world to which you pose questions, right? And my thinking is that, in part, this is what we are in the business of. We are probing and pushing for answers to the fundamental questions of our existence. Who are we? What are we? When are we? Why are we? And Camus argues that we pose these questions, we shout these questions at the world, and we are met with silence. For him, this is the absurdity of life, that we pose these questions, we articulate them with such passion, and the world responds with silence. But for him, this is not reason for nihilism, right? This is not, it doesn't make it okay to just surrender to absurdity, that one continues to fight. Du Bois, in 1903, gives this impression that regardless of whether our effort is fundamentally useful, and Du Bois is a humanist, whether this is fundamentally productive or not, it's what we can do. You push. And Camus raises the same sort of possibility, and for me this has framed so much of what I think about humanism, that Camus raises the same possibility that regardless of outcomes, you push. You struggle because you can. And he gives us a wonderful way of thinking about this. He pulls us into mythology and says, think about Sisyphus. And not only think about Sisyphus, that short essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, in that book, The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Essays, it's only roughly 4 pages long. And at the end of it, he says this: one must imagine Sisyphus happy. He doesn't say Sisyphus is happy. He says one must imagine Sisyphus happy. That Sisyphus is not defeated by this endless task. The gods think they have Sisyphus, that they have crushed him for his disobedience by forcing him to perpetually roll this rock up the hill. But Camus says he is not defeated by this. Why? Because Sisyphus develops awareness, or what Camus labels lucidity, a deep awareness of our circumstances, and a determination to push regardless. Camus says if there is even the slightest victory, it's when Sisyphus reaches the top of that hill, just before the stone rolls back down. If there is a glimmer of hope, if there is the possibility of overcoming, it's at that point. Then the rock rolls down. And Sisyphus commits himself to pushing it yet again. I've wanted to think about ethics within the context of a humanist environment in a very similar way, that it's not about outcomes. We can't guarantee outcomes. But what we can do is maximize whatever creativity, imagination, and tenacity we have to work to try to make a difference. And in the work, claim a victory. If nothing else, to claim a victory within the context of the work. I just think this is vital. And I see signs of this sort of thinking in a recent development, Black Lives Matter. It is different than the civil rights movement in a variety of ways, right? I mean, some of this is low-hanging fruit, right? That it has a structure of leadership, to the extent you can even say it has a structure of leadership, that runs contrary to the civil rights model of hierarchy. That is not how this functions, right? A very different model of leadership. But it also seems to me that within the context of Black Lives Matter, you also have an openness to perspective, to difference, to tension. Right? That Black Lives Matter is not afraid of tension and paradox, and you get some sense of this through its ability to incorporate diametrically opposed theological positions. You can be Christian, you can be atheist, and still involved, and find a grammar, a language, a vocabulary that speaks your truth within the context of this movement. I think that is mind-blowing. It also seems to me that unlike the civil rights movement that was all about outcomes, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. There will be outcomes, right? Outcomes in large part because the assumption was they did not work alone. This is King's civil rights movement, not James Foreman's, but King's civil rights movement. They did not work alone, so they would overcome. It seems to me with Black Lives Matter, you get something that's much more consistent with our humanist sensibilities, that it's not wise within the context of our social arrangements to become preoccupied with outcomes because we are fickle. We are capable of great good, but we are prone to great harm. Where's the certainty of victory in that? And so Black Lives Matter, it seems to me, hasn't been preoccupied with outcomes, but has been preoccupied with troubling our assumptions, right? Forcing us to confront our discomfort and to recognize why we are uncomfortable. And in a certain way, it has forced us to recognize the consequences of embodied existence, that we are embodied bodies moving through the world. It has forced us to wrestle with the connotations and the consequences of that understanding. Not outcomes, but what undergirds the problem. And even the way in which it gets phrased, Black Lives Matter, has pointed out some of this underlying structure. Like the quick push to all lives matter. Yeah? Kind of points out some of the dynamics of life in the United States that on the surface seem liberal and progressive, but really reinforce a normative stance that privileges certain bodies that don't look like mine. And Black Lives Matter has exposed this. And so it seems to me that there are ways in which, if we are careful humanists, if we are observant humanists, we can see possibilities, right? Despite dominant conversation, we can see possibilities for humanist sensibilities, humanist attitudes, and humanist moral and ethical structures to help us struggle, to help us push this rock, that in a variety of ways, we are legion. These sensibilities are widely expressed, they're embedded in current movements, and it seems to me we do ourselves a disservice if we don't analyze, explore, and engage, understanding that we may not get it right, but risk is part of the beauty of life. Thank you.
Microphone, I think. And if it's okay, we'll just go around and
sure.
And take
Let's
a few
chat.
questions. You know, if I were 20 years younger, I would sign up to be your PhD student. I can listen to this guy all day. Yeah. Can you hear it? Is it working? No. No, it's not
Slide
working.
it up.
Slide it up.
No,
there's
a power
Oh.
slides it.
I think it's on.
I think it's on. Yeah, so we need to be behind the speaker here, it looks like.
Don't cover it. Don't cover it.
Don't cover it?
Don't
Okay.
cover it.
Don't cover it?
Try speaking into it.
Turn it down? Okay. Yeah. Now I'm
afraid.
Why don't we turn it all the way down and I'll turn it
Turn the
on?
other mic off.
Yeah. Oh, that might work.
That might work.
Okay, got it all the way off if that's two.
Okay.
You'll be the last.
Yeah.
Okay, now we've got this one working?
It's not
It's
on.
not?
Try it now. Try
Yeah, I think
speaking.
it's on. Just because it's not squeaking.
Whoa, needs to go down though. Yeah.
Now, yeah.
There you go.
fact that I was a professional DJ for 10 years doesn't show up here. Sorry, I do know how to work a microphone, sorry. Anyway, let's get back. So we are going to take a few questions, and so yes, let me bring the microphone over to you.
Hi.
Hey.
Isn't the answer justice? I mean, that's where the problem lies, is the justice system, because it has a finality to it. Conviction is final, and we don't know how can we destroy white supremacy in the justice system in the United States of America? That's the question we don't know.
Well, from my vantage point, the justice system and the dilemma of the justice system is a symptom of a larger, it's a symptom of a larger tradition of disregard. Right? So I don't know that simply fixing the prison system fixes the problem when there's a larger suspicion and disregard for bodies that have a particular type of look. And so there will just be other ways to render that population docile. Right? I mean, that's what the prison system is about. It's about confining and rendering these bodies docile. And while you're at it, get some labor. But again, from my vantage point, that is a symptom of a much larger and more deeply ingrained problem.
Who else has a question? Behind me. Okay, here we go. We're going to hope it doesn't reach as I go around.
That leads me right into I just finished reading the new Jim Crow. Have you read it? A lot of people here read it? I just found it fascinating and scary, and there was no doubt in my mind that that was the start of the Black Lives Movement. And I'll leave it open. I'll let you comment. I really was impressed with it.
Well, it seems to me that Black Lives Matter as a movement.
His is not on.
Sorry.
I turned it all the way up. I think it's turned off up there.
Oh,
So maybe give that microphone to
well, yeah,
Tony.
maybe I want to just go back and forth.
Why don't you just use the other microphone here?
Yeah, let's
Maybe
just-
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so we
Okay.
can keep that there.
All right.
That many of the organizers talked in terms of the death of Trayvon Martin, right, and Michael Brown as a launching point for Black Lives Matter. Michelle Alexander is pointing to a system that is much older, right? If you can't get free labor anymore, can't call them slaves anymore, we still got work to do. Is there a way to still get this labor? But it seems to me that the organizers are pointing to more recent episodes of violent disregard as the launching point. And that they also argue, and so if you look at stories online, like her story, right, the kind of history of Black Lives Matter, they talk in terms of kind of general concern for the marginalized. And that includes blacks, but even if you just say blacks, then have you really wrestled with the dilemma of black women, for example, right? Or, right, I mean, it's much larger than that. They think in terms of the disadvantaged, the marginalized, and that this becomes a way of pointing out a dilemma that is deeply embedded in the psyche of the nation. And it gets played out, I mean, it's being played out in rather graphic ways. Right? So my European friends just kind of laugh and they say, well, you know, this American exceptionalism, this naive slumber that we are not like the rest of the world has been broken, right? That we've been shaken out of this slumber by the election of the Donald, right? Something that was said to never be possible, right? That there are ways in which, even within the context of the United States, there's a kind of graphic depiction of disregard.
Thank you.
What's the name of the documentary we showed at church?
13.
If the new Jim Crow doesn't convince you, that will, I think. So
It's a brilliant documentary.
My question kind of swigs into that very same thing. And earlier I had heard someone speak about the tremendous economic disparity that we have in this country, which is growing. And this person referenced that what we will ultimately are moving towards is economic apartheid. And since, to the largest degree, the black community represents one of the largest disadvantaged groups, that is something that we are moving towards. And it's represented, as I see it, in a conflict between democracy, a Republican democracy, and capitalism, which basically are in conflict. And that's what we see rising up from the ground, Black Lives Matter and many of these other issues.
I mean, certainly there's an economic dimension, but I think back to the early presence of my ancestors here. There was an economic motivation that was justified through a racial disregard, right? So it seems to me, that you can't resolve the economic dilemma until you deal with this larger, unspoken disregard for difference, right? That we have in this country a sense of difference that is deeply problematic. It's an assumption that difference is a problem to be solved. It's a disease within the social body that has to be isolated and corrected. And what we end up with, when difference is understood that way, is the preservation of whiteness as normative. Right? So if we don't have a different way of thinking about difference, if we can't develop a comfort with paradox and tension, then you can't really resolve these sorts of issues, because you might be able to increase the economic opportunities of African Americans, for example, but we will just develop a new group, right? We will simply replace this group with another if we don't wrestle with a deeper sense of disregard and suspicion towards difference.
I have kind of a theological question, maybe. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way that you see humanism really moving within a specifically Black context. I'm thinking about the End of God talk and some of the work that you did in that book. If you could speak a little bit about how it shows up in similar ways or in a different way than it shows up in majority white contexts.
Okay, so I don't know how many people are familiar with the End of God talk. So okay, so a few. So I'll talk more generally.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It strikes me, for marginalized communities, the entry point may be different, right? And that some of the assumptions concerning what humanism is and what it can achieve will be different. So my argument is, for African Americans, an embrace of humanism is a critique of the Enlightenment, right? It's not an embrace of the Enlightenment, it's a critique of the Enlightenment. Yeah, because it's a claiming of personhood, it's a claiming of deep value that the Enlightenment did not provide this population, right? And so the entry point is different. And in having a different entry point, it seems to me that humanism does a different type of work, right? That humanism functions in the United States in concert with social categories, race, gender, class, sexuality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That it is already and always connected to those. And so the kind of work humanism does is dependent upon a person and a group's relationship to these social codes.
I'm trying to write that all down.
Yeah, I always just need to take notes when Tony's talking. I saw a hand up. By the way, one of the upcoming journals, our Religious Humanism Journal, will be a transcript of the 100 Years of Humanism celebration that we did at First Unitarian Society. Tony was our featured panelist, and we had some great conversation there, so be looking out for that, and we'll be getting that out as soon as we can.
Teresa Allen, and I'm from the Woodlands, Texas. My question is, you said just a minute ago something about difference, and we need, I don't know, can you possibly repeat it? It had something to do with like deep-seated, we had not explored the fact that difference...
We have a twisted sense of difference.
Okay,
right?
So the sermon today, the minister said, revolutionary love is love partnered with justice, and love is a commitment to act in ways that honor interconnectedness and a rejection of the lie that difference is a threat. A rejection of the lie that difference is a threat. So do you have any suggestions for us for how we should confront the lie that difference is a threat?
You know, that's always a hard question for me because it has to be contextual, right? That there are ways in which I feed into the problem. If I stand here or anywhere else and without familiarity with your context, tell you what you ought to be doing in it, right? So I can't really give you a satisfying response other than to say, you'll have a sense that you are doing this right if you are uncomfortable. Right? If this pushes you out of your comfort zone, then you're doing it right. But you can't do this sort of work, whether you want to call it justice work, whatever you want to call it, you can't do this sort of work and think you're gaining ground if you're comfortable. Right? That is an important marker. You ought to be uncomfortable. It also seems to me that it's contextual, right? What are the dynamics of difference within your particular context? And what do you do to address difference as a positive within your own context? And I see on some level it requires rendering our communities porous. Like kind of inviting folks in a way that fundamentally transforms what we do and how we do it. Right? That it's no good to simply say come, but do it the way we've been doing it. Right? Come, but you can't have this position or that position. Just sit and look pretty. Right? That this is a problem. That again, if we're doing this work right, we ought to be uncomfortable. That is a marker of that's a thumbs up, right? That is a marker of progress in terms of our own development with respect to difference. We ought to be uncomfortable.
But can you possibly just give us an example of somebody that did it right? Because I can't move forward saying, well, if I'm uncomfortable, then I'm doing it right.
Right, but I also said, you're in the Woodlands, yeah? Okay, so I don't know much about the Woodlands. It isn't a place I've ventured to, right? So I cannot give you, I can give you examples of how people are doing it elsewhere that will mean nothing in the context of the Woodlands, right? It would mean nothing in the context of Houston. So it seems to me that on some level you have to venture outside of your safety zone, venture into communities that you don't normally venture into and take notes, just and listen, right? And if this is justice work, then find out what folks that are disadvantaged need and provide it. That we often have a tendency to assume we know what folks need, right? And that missionary impulse is deeply problematic, right? Ask them what they need and provide it. But I can't give you, it would be counterproductive for me to try to give you concrete strategies for your environment when I don't really know it.
At my congregation, we have a social justice minister, and we were working on our mission statement the other day, and one of the words was justice. And she said, no, we're not going to deal with that anymore. There is no justice. We're going to talk about liberation from now on, because justice is so far from possible just now, we're going to stop talking about it.
Hi, Dr. Pinn.
Hey.
Kelly Weissman, Ruth Jackson from Beverly, Massachusetts. I want to preface the question by saying, by my lights, the three most important voices of non-theism in our country right now are Ta-Nehisi Coates, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and yourself. So given that context, given that reality, and aware that I'm not asking you to speak to my context, you don't know my context, but rather to our shared context, both being in the United States, and so we're all in the same mess at the moment. What is your highest aspiration for what morally engaged non-theism, sometimes called humanism, sometimes not, can accomplish now, here and now, and perhaps over the next decade? What are you hoping? Maybe what's your highest hope? Maybe not the realistic one. And so where we can go from where we are now.
To be consistently disruptive, right? And for me, that means not allowing those who are around us to be comfortable with easy answers, right? To continuously disrupt what we think we know, right? To constantly disrupt what we think we know. And in that way, produce a kind of discomfort that allows us an opportunity to be creative and imaginative, because we push past what's normative and what we assume needs to be in place. So to be perpetually disruptive, this is my highest aspiration for us.
Hey, Dr. Pinn, I want to say thanks for coming out. Quick question for you. On what metaphysical basis do you affirm that Black lives and lives of color matter, given the fact that you talked about Dr. King, people like Cohn and others had the God of the oppressed. So how do you answer the worth question or the value question?
I wouldn't make it a metaphysical claim, right? And so I'm understanding metaphysics to revolve around two things: ontology, the sense of being, and epistemology, what we can know, right? So I'm not making that claim. I've often said that what we really have to be saying is Black lives should matter.
Okay.
Right? Because they clearly, within the context of the United States, don't. Right? But I think that is in part the beauty of the movement, that it forces us to wrestle with some of these deeper, metaphysical, as you put it, assumptions concerning where life is, how it's constituted, and how it's valued. So yeah, I would not make a metaphysical claim in that regard.
So then on what basis should it matter?
On what basis should Black lives matter? Well, all we have to do is look at the flip side. To the extent that we know that whiteness and white lives have mattered within the context of the United States, that has come with certain perks, right? And these certain perks ought to be shared. These are material perks. So all I have to do is look at the folks who don't look like me, and as a community, understand that things have gone fairly well for them. And I want that to go, I want that sort of stuff for my people.
The very first Humanist Manifesto said we want a shared life in a shared world.
Yeah.
And I don't think it gets much better than that.
I want to ask you I'm Richard Palmer, Venice, Florida. I want to ask you the hardest question for me. I understand what you're saying about Black Lives Matter, but I also understand, if I look at murder statistics in the United States, 20 times more blacks are killed by other blacks than they are by the man or any power structure. And when I try to ask people who are directly or indirectly involved about Black Lives Matter, they seem to say, so what? And if Black Lives Matter, doesn't that matter?
A couple of things I'd say on that. One, we're not going to blame the victims.
Right. I'm not blaming the victims.
Well, let me finish. That we're not going to blame the victims, that there is black on black crime, but the idea that this isn't somehow connected to the man is to assume that these folks don't live within the context of a world in which they are not normative, right? That the impingement of whiteness and white supremacy is already and always. It is everywhere. And so there are structures of existence that have been put into place that disadvantage these communities, and what you get is an acting out of this frustration. But it is already and always connected, from my vantage point, to whiteness and white supremacy, without a doubt.
So it's always the white person's fault, right?
Well, hear what I'm saying. Hear what I'm saying.
Okay.
You made it about persons. I made it about whiteness and white supremacy.
No, I just asked, don't they matter?
Right,
and
but
how do we deal with that?
I'm going with your last comment, that it's always the white man's fault, right? The white person's fault. And I'm saying that what I am critiquing is whiteness and white supremacy. And whites participate in that in a variety of ways, not in the same way. So, for example, within the context of higher education, you don't have to be white and wealthy to benefit from white supremacy. That there are ways in which that embodied whiteness means a certain perspective from the instructor, right? So it would not be unusual then for the white student, the assumption to be this person is capable of the A and have to prove otherwise. Whereas there are social assumptions connected to that black body that means that's an F student, prove otherwise. Who's going to end up with the better grade? And you don't have to come from Shaker Heights for that to be the case. Yeah? So there are ways in which there are soft and hard forms of privilege. Right? And so it seems to me even a level of surprise at what's taking place in the nation constitutes a certain form of privilege operating. Whereas for the most despised elements of our collective population, what is happening within our country, yes. Surprise, no, this has always been the case. Lynching just looks different now. Right, so there are ways that there's certain kind of assumptions that one can make concerning what they are entitled to. Right there, and this is the last comment on that. And another way in which white supremacy and the value of whiteness operates is that it is often the case, if whites are not doing well, the assumption is not that they have some sort of inherent shortcoming. It's the larger framework, the larger system that is working against them. But it has been the case within the context of the United States for black and brown bodies. If they are not doing well, the assumption is they don't want to do well or they don't have the capacity to do well. We've heard this stated explicitly, yes?
Yeah.
We have a question right here.
So I had a question about, I guess the shift you said to happen with Black Lives Matter. It's a two-part question. Do you find that to be an anomaly only for the younger generation of African Americans that are turning away potentially from the church? Do you see that as a trend? And then the second question is for those like myself who no longer find, I guess, fulfillment or a sense of purpose in the black church, and then, you know, go to the Universalist church and find myself as a minority. Like, where do I go? Or in your personal life, where did you go when there was no sense of community for the thoughts and feelings and expressions of belief that you had?
That's a whole lot. Let me do what I can do. Right? So, certainly millennials are playing a role in Black Lives Matter, but you have so-called Generation X, and you have baby boomers who are also involved in this. It seems to me there's a certain sensibility, on one level, of a frustration with civil rights strategies that have not produced the kind of sustained outcomes we assumed could be produced. Yeah? And recognition that our particular historical moment, let's take the past decade, requires a different sense of awareness or lucidity, a different range of strategies, and a different approach to tackling the process. And I want to say that this cuts across generations. Where millennials have been particularly helpful from my vantage point is the way in which Black Lives Matter has brilliantly used social media and technology. Without a doubt, without a doubt. In terms of the second question, when I left the black church, I was an AME. I was an AME minister, right? When I left the black church and folks found out that I was a non-theist teaching religion, the first people who reached out to me were UUs, right? And first they said, look, we're not going to pretend like we understand what you're dealing with, because we don't. But if you want a space in which you can share your story, come to Minneapolis, right? So there are ways, for me, Unitarian Universalists have been a welcoming home. This has been a welcoming home, and Meadville Lombard Theological School in particular has really given me an opportunity to wrestle with ideas, right? To kind of think these things deeply in a way that was compelling to me. But I recognized there was some stuff I was not going to get. Right? The look of the UU congregation was not the look of Bridge Street AME Church. And so my attitude is we have to think about community in a way that is complex, layered, and expansive. that in the same way our identities involve us occupying numerous social spaces simultaneously, our sense of community, right, as humanists, also has to involve this occupation of multiple social spaces simultaneously. So there's some stuff you'll get from a UU congregation, and on top of that, there's stuff that you'll get from local humanist organizations, and then there's some stuff that you'll get from a more expansive network of African American humanists, for example, right? That it's not one-stop shopping, that we have to kind of layer this and layer our experience because our identities are layered. But while you're in that congregation, push them to give you what you need.
Yeah.
Last question. We've got snacks coming in at 7:15, so
Lots of pressure.
Well, I'm glad you're here, and thank you for the End of God talk and all that you do. So I'm thinking about disruption, and I'm thinking about discomfort, and then I'm imagining Sisyphus happy, and I'm wondering what can make Sisyphus happy.
It's the perpetual rebellion, right? The constant striving for more, the pushing for more. In that is the happiness. I think about it this way, that our obligation as humanists is it's a matter of perpetual rebellion, right? Constantly pushing for more. Constantly pushing for more. But again, we can't be clear on what the outcome is, because over the course of time, as our awareness increases, we recognize the various ways in which we oppress and are oppressed, and we weren't fully conscious of, right? That we are constantly evolving in terms of our understanding of how we touch the world and how we touch others. So what's down the road, that end product, we can't know, but to continuously strive, to continuously push, to continuously rebel. And my attitude is, if there is anything we might label liberation, it's involved in the struggle. It is named in the struggle, not the outcome. That there is something exciting, there is something renewing, there is something liberative in the struggle. There's something liberative in our consistent no to injustice. That, if Sisyphus can be imagined as happy, it has to do with that. The ability to continuously say, no, it has to be different.
If I think we need to invent a new award, which would be Humanist of the Decade, maybe. So you can get this again. It has been so wonderful. I mean, I think that one of the things that we didn't realize, because again, white normativity, is that we thought humanism was the answer, you know, because, you know, hey, it's us, it's white, you know, it's, you know, and we're normal, right? And so the reading Tony, I think, is showing us the way to get out of that really, really bad loop. Thank you so much for being who you are.